Well, as I said at the beginning, it's a joy to be with you for the first time, but this also marks really a notable first for me as well. This is the first time I've ever celebrated Mass in a church dedicated to St. John Paul II. So this is a particular joy because I am very much a part of that so-called JP2 generation of priests. He was the Pope for really my whole childhood. And then I had the great fortune of studying theology in Rome. And so I spent 4 years where he was just down the street. And so I got a good close-up look at how he operated. I got a chance to study his writings, to learn from his example. And so I definitely consider myself formed and shaped in his teachings and his witness. And certainly there are not many saints that I can say, well, I've shaken their hand. Now, I'm sure now that I'm here, it's going to be a lot more down the road after I shake everybody's hands. There'll be a lot more saints that I can say that about. But for now, it's a pretty small list. Now, as I was reflecting on his life, celebrating his feast day yesterday and coming here, and looking at the Gospels that we have, I decided to narrow down my reflections about his life in terms of what our readings give to us, because he has such a long and rich life. There are many different directions that you could go in preaching the gospel with him as a witness to the gospel. But one of the things that has always struck me about his life is the resiliency of his life. He was a man who was born with a lot of talent. He had a great deal of potential as a child in his intelligence, in his athletic ability, in his charisma, all of the things that we would eventually see him very famously as Pope. They were already a part of his life as a young man. And so there was a lot of potential, a lot of different directions that he could go in his life. And yet his life in many stages was marked by tragedy. As a young man, he began losing members of his family when his mother died. And then before he really became an adult in his own right, he had lost every member of his family. And so having to fashion a different identity without what so many of us can take for granted. And then when he started making plans for where he would direct his considerable energy and talent, he had laid out a plan only to have that taken away, crushed literally in a way hard for most of us to imagine, as the Nazis came in and took over his country, his city, his life. And instead of pursuing the goals that he had in mind, he was forced into labor, working in a rock quarry. Now, eventually, that oppression would end only to be replaced by another. When he would eventually become a bishop, a priest, and then a bishop, it was under the control of the communists that had then taken over and were keeping him under a constant scrutiny, a constant threat of saying the wrong thing and suffering the consequences for it. And yet, despite so many times that his life took different directions and the hopes that he had being taken away from him, he always responded by following God more closely, by seeing this path taken away and turning to God, saying, now what? It was that openness to the direction of God that caused him to be a priest, which might seem obvious to us, but when he made that decision, there wasn't even a path to becoming a priest. The seminary was closed. He couldn't just decide, I'm going to follow that. He had to go to great pains and then become trained as a priest in secret, depending on the support of other men working in this rock quarry. And so the path to following God was not easy, was not obvious, and yet he was so connected to following the will of God that he pursued that path despite the obstacles. He became a priest in secret. And then when he became a bishop, it was in large part because the communist rulers of Poland made a crucial blunder. They thought this academic priest won't cause us any trouble, and so we'll let him become a bishop. And so he not only became a bishop, but of course, as history confirms, became a pope that would work enormously to help free Poland and to help free the world in many ways. So no matter what happened in his life, no matter what obstacles he faced, he responded with generosity and with faith. Now, from this direction, connecting it to the Gospels, to our readings for today, I want to talk about his life of prayer. Because the way that he navigated all of these difficulties, the way he understood God's will, despite what seemed impossible, was his prayer. He would famously be caught in times of prayer. No matter where he traveled in the world, people would go to his room and couldn't find him, only to discover him face down in front of the tabernacle, praying in front of the Blessed Sacrament. And even when he didn't have moments of private, he would talk about circling crowds of people in a helicopter and contemplating the face of God on the face of the people he would encounter by the millions. Always connected to God, deeply rooted in the life of prayer. And since we are celebrating his feast and have the readings that we have, I want to use his life and his prayer as an example for all of us. The first reading says, "The prayer of the lowly pierces the clouds. It does not rest until it reaches its goal." Now, I suspect that there are a lot of us here who wish our prayer was better, who have a sense that despite our efforts at prayer, it isn't quite what I wish it was. The problem is, when we try to correct our prayer, we sometimes try to make the correction in the wrong way. We try to change what we pray, how we pray. But what the scriptures today tell us is that the path to deeper and better prayer is not more about what we do, it's about where it comes from within us. Again, that quote, "The prayer of the lowly pierces the clouds." And in the gospel, we get Jesus highlighting this as he tells us a parable. He makes a very strong, clear comparison between fake prayer and authentic prayer. So you have the famous man, the Pharisee, the one who was prominent in his community, standing up, praying and talking about all of the things that he did well. And there's no reason to doubt that those things were true. He did, in fact, practice his faith in this very public way. But then there's the comparison of this sinner, this tax collector that most people would have written off as hopelessly far from God. And Jesus raises him as the champion of prayer, as he knelt in the back, beating his breast, saying, "Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner." The lowly kind of prayer that we hear about in our first reading. So the path to greater prayer for each one of us is a turning inward to look at, where is my prayer coming from? What does it mean to have a lowly heart as I go about my prayer? What does it mean to be like that tax collector who says, "Lord, have mercy on me"? Now, I think that there is a certain mentality that we can cultivate to strengthen our prayer. Very often when people say that their prayer isn't what they want it to be, it's because they are praying for certain things and it seems like that's never happening, so I must be praying the wrong way. The thing I'm praying for doesn't happen. What am I doing wrong? Well, the basic mentality that I suggest to you as a way to cultivate deeper prayer is to pray in whatever form you use with a heart that says, "God, I want what you want. I want what you want." If that's not the mentality, the starting point of our heart in prayer, it isn't going to work the way that it should. Because what happens instead is, "God, there's this situation, and I know how to handle it, and as soon as you see it my way, this will go better." That's the more common way of praying. We judge God and say, "Obviously this is a good and it hasn't happened. God must not be listening." And so we tend to approach prayer in some way as convincing God to see what in our wisdom we have realized. Now it seems silly as I describe it this way, But partly we laugh because we know how that prayer sounds in our heads. Okay, God. And so the fundamental shift is our prayer should be, God, I want what you want. When we pray that way, the change that's happening is not me convincing God to understand what he clearly isn't paying attention to, but rather the change that happens is the change in me. A change that has as its starting point, God is God. The creator of everything probably knows something I don't know. And so any change that's needed ought to come in here, not up there. And so, God, I want what you want. That first reading, again, beautifully describes prayer with another line that says, the one who serves God willingly is heard. And so it's another measure for us. The one who serves God willingly. Instead, we sometimes approach God as, God, you need to serve what I'm asking for. When you serve me, my life will be better. And so we flip this around and we get it completely backwards. It's no wonder our prayer doesn't work the way that we think it should. So to serve God means that I genuinely put my life in God's hands. And then God does what he will. Even when the result is different than I wanted, God is still God. And if what's happening does not make sense to me, it's just because I can only see in a limited way. To pray like this, to really be a servant for God's will, to be lowly of heart, that takes real faith. Because what faith means is that when I don't understand, it doesn't mean that God has just said no to my prayer. It means that God sees what I do not see. And my faith says, trust God further than I can see, because my sight is limited. And so come back to the life and example of Pope John Paul II. He had all kinds of very good things that he could do in his life. And what derailed the good plans that he had in his life were things that make no sense at all from a human perspective. The death of his family, oppression from a foreign army in his home, forced into labor. None of that makes any sense. It would have been very easy for him to say, God, I've been trying to serve you, but how can I? Look what keeps happening. But instead, his prayer was, God, I want what you want. I want what you want. And when what I thought you wanted is not clear now, it's because I need to grow and understand more fully, what do you want? And eventually, this shaping and molding the life of this man would lead him to becoming this great leader of our world. Someone with the charisma and power and prayer to bring about freedom for a whole nation, for a large part of the world. And so what God wanted for this man was that his strength and ability be directed in the particular way that causes us to celebrate him now. But his story goes further still. Because for all of the incredible strength and witness of his life, God's will for him and the willingness to serve that John Paul II showed did not end when he accomplished things on the global scale. Think about the last years of his life. This man, known for his vigor, for his strength, for his ability to travel the world and engage millions of people, he found himself trapped in a wheelchair, not even able to speak clearly as his whole body and his face drooped under the weight of Parkinson's disease. And so instead of now being a man of strength according to that human stature, he had to demonstrate a strength that could be seen in human weakness. The kind of thing that causes other people to turn away and say, I'm not comfortable with that. He doesn't look too good. He himself had to embrace the reality that he could not articulate the way that he once did. And there was frustration in him, and yet he did not back down. He continued to put himself in front of the world to say, this is what it looks like to be human, even this weakness. But in the hands of God, this is not weakness. Because no matter what ups and downs he faced, no matter what happened as his body began to betray him, his prayer did not change, because his prayer was always, God, I want what you want. And if that's our prayer, then it's not going to matter what happens. The frustration that he felt as his body betrayed him could be purified so that he remained the tax collector saying, Lord, have mercy on me. He remained the man from our first reading that says the lowly has his prayer penetrate the heavens, because he wanted what God wanted. And he was allowing himself to be shaped into the man God needed him to be, even at the very end of his weakened life. And so as we celebrate this feast today, this is my prayer for all of us, that we will learn from his example of prayer, the kind of prayer that is the foundation for whatever our life holds, no matter what strength or weakness we face, no matter what clear path or dark cloud we are in. What does not change is the loving will of God that sees beyond our momentary reality to the great reality of God's design. And so my hope is that we will pray, God, I want what you want. John Paul II finished the race of his life in a way that inspired millions. He inspires us and calls us to be like him, not in the accomplishments that he necessarily was able to fulfill, but with the same heart that approaches God in a lowly way, to say, because I trust you, because I pray in faith, I know that my prayer allows you to shape my life. And so then I can be confident that the lowly prayer of my heart also rises to heaven.